Why, hello there. I didn't see you come in. You may be wondering what I'm wearing this week. As you can see, this is a lanyard from last year's South by Southwest Film Festival I got for volunteering my services, as well as this pretty sick t-shirt. Yeah, look at that. Check that out. Limited edition, baby. I was planning on attending again this year, but unfortunately I had to pull out due to some financial difficulties. And then South by went ahead and got canceled anyways, thanks to this pandemic that I'm getting really tired of talking about. But thankfully, it hasn't been all doom and gloom for South by. They struck a deal with Amazon Prime last month to run several of their short films, features, and episodic premieres for free on the Amazon Prime streaming service. That means that anyone, even if you don't even have an Amazon Prime account, could access these shorts and films or whatever entirely for free. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very large selection because a lot of the bigger titles already have distribution or are in negotiations to get distributed, so they didn't want to have to deal with the legal headaches of putting their films out there for free and putting potential profits on the line. So there are only about 7 features, 3 episodic premieres, and I want to say about 29 short films on hand. So even though the film festival is over, I still felt it was appropriate to post this episode up now, because when a lot of these shorts or films do become available for the public to watch, I would like to use this as like signal boosting for some of my personal favorites that I watched during this period. Obviously, I'm not going to be reviewing everything. I originally wanted to dive into all 40 titles that were available, but I read a couple of tweets a few days back really highlighting how there should be some trepidation about giving negative reviews to films that are struggling to find distribution or films from first-time filmmakers, just because, I don't know, it feels like you're kind of kicking people while they're down, especially during this pandemic when it's becoming incredibly difficult to get eyes onto your film. I don't know, I kind of have to agree with that. I'm going to go ahead and not dive into the short films, the films that I straight up did not like. Instead, this is just going to be more of a positive vibes kind of thing going on. Pretty much anything that I'm going to take a look at or highlight for you guys, I didn't give a score lower than a 6 out of 10. If you do want to watch the films I don't mention, just keep an eye out for them. There's a whole list of everything that ran at the festival on Letterboxd. I'll post the link in the description, and you can take a look at that after I'm finished talking your head off here. So because there is a lot of content in this episode, this is going to be a longer episode than usual. I'm going to try and keep it brief. And I also have to make a note that there won't be much visual aid this week, so you won't be seeing many clips or trailer clips in this episode because they're just isn't publicly available right now. A lot of these films made their big premiere at South by Southwest, so unfortunately you're just going to have to get used to looking at my face for a little while. Hope you guys can bear with that. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at my favorite of the features that were shown at the 2020 South by Southwest collection on Amazon Prime. The first film I want to take a look at is my personal favorite among the collection. It's not a perfect movie, but I think out of all 7 films that were a part of this collection, it's the one that's going to stick with me the most, and it is the Guatemalan film Gunpowder Heart. The film tells the story of a lesbian couple living in Guatemala City who are just kind of living their life, dreaming of escaping their pretty shitty lifestyle, when one night on a date they are both attacked and sexually assaulted by a trio of circus workers. Both women take different approaches to how to move on from this attack. Claudia wants to just leave the city and move to the United States, while her girlfriend, Maria, is single-minded about pursuing revenge against her attackers. Out of all of the films in this collection, this is the one that felt the most complete. This film is a debut feature for its director and writer and its stars. In fact, a lot of the people that were behind and in front of the camera in this movie have never worked on a feature before, or even a short film. What makes Gunpowder Heart so tangibly good when compared to the other films in this collection, and I'm not saying that all of them were bad, but this is just the one that felt the most right. The movie does a great job capturing a mood, and it captures a place. The cinematography in this film, it's that rare kind of film where you can really feel the air that is being shown in the movie. Like, you could almost feel the humidity. You could touch the surfaces. There's just a real sense that this is a lived-in place, and the movie doesn't try to clean it up or really bog down its griminess. It doesn't try and make it look artificial at all. Everything in this movie looks and feels real. There are also some very exquisitely framed shots in this film too. One shot that really sticks in my head is the final scene that both leads share together. And it's a pretty long take. It's about, I want to say, 2 minutes. And it just has some incredible blocking and makes fantastic use of the entire frame. Especially the way it uses negative space and positioning on opposite ends of the screen. But another thing that makes Gunpowder Heart so special for me was the chemistry between both leads. Like I mentioned before, these were first-time actors. They haven't done anything before this film, and yet they both feel so natural in front of the camera. There's a genuine romantic chemistry that can be felt between both leads, and also a strong sense of friendship. Both women look incredibly comfortable in front of the camera and are able to navigate the highs and lows that these characters go through with such ease. Whether it's their loving date, when they make out and have sex, or the aftermath of when they're assaulted. These two leads really carry this film. They do a fantastic job bringing these two women who have been through a lot of horrible things to life, and it makes their struggle throughout the film all the more real. The only reason I can't give this film full marks is it kind of falls apart in the second half of the movie. New characters are introduced that don't really feel like they belong in the film. New plot threads are introduced and then summarily dropped. The film just gets really messy. I'm gonna go ahead and give Gunpowder Heart a 7 out of 10. But for a debut film, I think this movie shows a ton of promise, and I cannot wait to see what comes next from these filmmakers. The next movie I want to take a look at is I'm Gonna Make You Love Me, a documentary about Brian Belovich, a man who began his life as a gay boy growing up in Rhode Island before moving to New York City in his teens and transitioning into a woman before deciding to transition back into a man in the later part of his life, moving back to Rhode Island and finding the man he was always meant to be with. It's a heartwarming documentary about the life story of what it means to be really the shining example of gender fluidity. What really stands out about this movie is Brian himself, both as Brian and as the woman he was for a short period of time, Natalia. There's a ton of amazing archive footage that you can find in this film, really highlighting the chaotic world of the New York City nightlife scene in the 1980s and what it meant to be an LGBT person growing up in that decade. What makes this film so captivating is Brian himself. I think he's an immensely entertaining subject. He's super frank about just about everything in his life. He shows you the scars of his plastic surgery. He's extremely frank about, his sexual escapades. It's one of those shining examples of a pitch perfect documentary title. I'm Gonna Make You Love Me is really Brian's life mantra. But it never gets to the point where you grow sick of it, because there is a true earnestness about Brian. Really, it's Brian himself that made me get through this documentary, following his journey, following his story of living both as a man and as a woman, and then back to a man again in the crazy, drug-filled, sex-filled world of New York City in the 1980s, managing to survive that as a transgender woman. It's a shame that it is undone by some pretty substandard filmmaking. The structure for I'm Gonna Make You Love Me is really bizarre. It dances around from one point in Brian's life to another unrelated point, decades apart. We begin the film, he's at the end of his story, then we kind of flip to the 1980s, and then back to the 1960s, and then back to the 1980s, and it just goes all over the place. And there's also a lot of interspersed film clips thrown into the picture to try, I guess, to illustrate a point that comes off as more gimmicky and cute than fitting. It's a really poorly edited documentary, which I don't usually see too often, but this was a noticeable example of that. It really distracted me and made the documentary a little harder to watch than it should have, just because the person at the center of it is so captivating and so entertaining that, man, I just wish that this film was told by better filmmakers. And I know that sounds like a huge diss to the documentarians, and it kind of is. But to be fair, they were the ones who sought out Brian and thought that his story was worth telling. So for that reason alone, I can't completely diss them, because without them, this story never would have been told. So for that reason, I still give I'm Gonna Make You Love Me a recommendation. It's a 6 out of 10, but I think it is worth your time if you're okay with a confusing structure that really doesn't do justice to the person at the center of it all. The next movie I want to take a look at is another documentary called My Darling Vivian, which tells the story of Johnny Cash's first wife, Vivian Liberto, as told by their 4 daughters. I'll be honest, all I knew about Vivian Liberto was from Walk the Line, which is funny enough. That's a movie I've already discussed briefly on this channel. And what sucks about this movie is that it makes Walk the Line look like total trash, and how it misrepresents Vivian Liberto. Walk the Line makes her look like a psychopath who's holding Johnny Cash back, abusive relationship, and yeah, My Darling Vivian does highlight that their relationship, after they got married and had a couple of kids and Johnny Cash became a big star, their relationship completely fell apart. My Darling Vivian really illustrates that Johnny Cash was an asshole dad who completely abandoned his family. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not a huge Johnny Cash fan. I didn't really grow up with his music. I'm not an expert in the field of Johnny Cashness. I do find his story fascinating, and I think his rendition of Hurt is one of the best songs of all time. But I've always had an inkling that Johnny Cash was a colossal asshole, and this movie kind of confirms it. My Darling Vivian is a pretty standard documentary. Its structure doesn't reinvent the wheel. It's told in a pretty stale fashion. Like, this was a documentary that could have aired on A&E back in the early 2000s. But what makes My Darling Vivian an important story is that this is a story of a woman who was basically erased from history. Not many Johnny Cash fans know that much about his first wife, except that there was a scandal about her being a black woman in a time when that was unacceptable And even though Vivian is Sicilian and her skin is darker than the average white person, the movie dives into how this scandal really rocked her world and put her in serious risk. There was a good chance Vivian Liberto and her 4 children could have been killed. For that reason, My Darling Vivian gets a recommendation from me. I still give it a 6 out of 10, but I think for what it has to say about this woman who has been virtually erased from rock and roll music history. And the last movie I want to highlight here is Le Choc de Futur, a French film, clearly. It takes place in the late 1970s, even though quite a few things in the film are a bit anachronistic. Like, this is just a weird personal anecdote, but literally in the first shot of the movie, there's like a bust of Captain Kirk in his outfit from Star Trek II, which came out in 1982. So already the movie's kind of fucking up on the small details. But anyways. The movie tells the story of a young woman who is into the synthesizer electronic music scene. Over the course of one day, we see this woman trying to craft her ultimate masterpiece that will finally get her noticed by big record labels. While at the same time, she's struggling with trying to come up with a cute commercial ditty and just these various people that come and go through her life in the span of this one day, trying to either add to or detract to the art that she's trying to create. I really like the concept of this film a lot. I think the lead performance is pretty captivating. I really liked the lead actress here. I thought she brought a nice sense of passion that was needed in order for this character to feel sympathetic, even when they weren't always a sympathetic character to follow. Sometimes they do err on the side of pretentiousness. I really like the soundtrack to this movie. Full disclosure here, I am a huge fan of electronic soundtracks, of synthesizers. I love that shit so much. And a whole movie about that? I mean, come on, of course I'm gonna watch it. This is a movie I probably would have watched at the film festival anyways. I thought a lot of the performances were really strong. I felt when there weren't obvious anachronisms, the movie did get a real feeling of a bygone era. I mean, just look at the fashion, look at the posters, the way people talk. When the film nails it, it really nails the time period. The film isn't a runaway success. It is definitely held back by a really tight budget. 90% of this movie takes place in the lead character's room. We don't really get to see much of late 1970s Paris, and when the movie does venture outside, the actors are like right in front of the camera lens, in focus. Everything behind them is blown out of focus. So it's pretty obvious to tell that they didn't have the money to do extensive production design, that I imagine most of the movie's budget was blown on the soundtrack, on the synthesizer setup that you see in the film, and I guess whatever costume design they could cobble together. The movie also gets kind of tedious at times. Like, characters just sort of flit in and out repeatedly. Not all of the characters are all that interesting. And even though the movie is barely over 75 minutes long, it does have a couple of pacing issues. It feels longer than it needs to be. Like, this is an example of a movie that probably would have worked better as a short film. And it's funny because a lot of the short films that were in this collection would have worked better as features, but you know, what can you do? And something else that bothered me about Le Choc de Futur is how it all takes place in a single day. In the span of one day, this character manages to craft an entire pretty well produced single, including vocals, including a beatbox track. She's able to pretty much pull this melody out of thin air and have it finished by the time she hosts a big house party that night. It all felt really weird, especially since at one point in this day, she steps out of her apartment to grab coffee for an undetermined amount of time. There's a lot of talking. It just makes you wonder, where the heck did all this time go? Like, how long was this day? But there was enough in the movie that I liked, and so it gets another 6 out of 10 here. If you're really into electronic music, I definitely would give it a look. The film just needed to be shorter, and if the movie was able to make better use of its budget, then I think it could have been a real winner. But as it is, it's still a fun watch, and one of the better of the films that was screened at the South by Southwest collection.